You already know the pattern. You give, you help, you stay patient, you stay available. And yet the world somehow responds as if your kindness is a default setting rather than a decision. You show up like a reliable service, quiet, stable, predictable, while everyone else around you behaves like customers who assume the machine never breaks. You keep pouring emotional labor into people who treat support like a renewable resource, unaware that you're running on fumes. Now forget whatever you're dealing with today. Let's walk through the truth together. You start with the best intentions, thinking generosity will naturally lead to connection. It's a belief many good people hold because it feels intuitive. When you invest in others, value should grow. But the emotional world isn't a clean spreadsheet. It's more like a grocery store where prices rise the moment something becomes too available. This is the inflation effect. When kindness has no boundary, no scarcity, and no intentionality, its perceived value drops. Not because people are evil, but because humans subconsciously adjust their expectations to whatever is consistently supplied. And once someone learns they can take from you without cost, without negotiation, without consequence, the emotional market shifts. Your effort turns into a background feature, like electricity, like Wi-Fi, like tap water. No one thanks their Wi-Fi for working. They only notice when it stops. This is where the first micro cracks form in your relationships. You think you're building goodwill. They think you're just doing what you're supposed to do. You imagine they'll one day return the favor. They assume no favor exists. In fact, the more you give without clarity, the more invisible your contribution becomes. It's not rewarded, it's absorbed. Toxic people don't create this system, ordinary people do. But toxic people thrive in it. They watch how far you'll go, how much you'll tolerate, how willing you are to inconvenience yourself for their comfort. They measure your limits before you realize you even have limits. In their minds, your kindness becomes a resource to be mined, not a gesture to be respected. And the first tragedy is subtle. You don't notice the shift, because you think you're still giving out of love, or empathy, or moral duty. But the truth is harsher. You're already giving out of fear. Fear of disappointing someone. Fear of seeming selfish. Fear of being abandoned. Fear that if you stop supplying kindness, you'll lose your place in their life. So you keep giving, and giving, and giving. And every time you do, the weight of the unpaid emotional debt grows. Not for them, for you. You're the one keeping score, even though you wish you weren't. You're the one hoping they'll wake up one day and realize all that you carried. But the emotional economy doesn't work retroactively. People don't suddenly appreciate what they've trained themselves to take for granted. You've built them a world where your kindness is the weather, constant, predictable, unquestioned. And in that world, storms aren't tragedies. They're inconveniences. You never meant for your compassion to become a burden. You thought it was your strength, and it is. But strength without strategy becomes exploitation. Goodness without wisdom becomes currency for the wrong people. And this is only the beginning. Because the moment your kindness becomes a silent expectation, the relationship stops being mutual. It becomes a marketplace where you pay and they benefit. And you're the only one who still believes it's love. The strange thing about human psychology is that appreciation has an expiration date. Not because people are ungrateful by nature, but because the brain adapts to whatever becomes familiar. This is the gratitude paradox. The more consistently you show up for someone, the less remarkable your presence feels. You start off as a blessing. You end up as background noise. It happens quietly. Someone initially admires how patient you are, how willing you are to compromise, how available your support seems. But over time, admiration mutates into assumption. The emotional thank you they once felt gets replaced with a subtle belief that your kindness is just who you are, and therefore, you don't deserve extra acknowledgement for it. In economic terms, your emotional currency stops circulating. Value freezes, the market collapses, and in this collapse, entitlement is born. This is where toxic relationships start to take shape, not through conflict, but through comfort. The other person gets so accustomed to receiving from you that the idea of giving back doesn't even cross their mind. Why would it? They've never been required to invest anything. You created an environment where gratitude wasn't necessary because you covered every need before it even surfaced. It's like handing someone a gym membership that doesn't require them to show up. If there's no cost, no sweat, no effort, why would they value the experience? They won't. They'll just assume the door will always unlock for them. The entitlement grows even more when your kindness becomes predictable. Humans don't crave fairness. They crave convenience. And you, without knowing it, have become the most convenient thing in their life. You adjust. You compromise. You absorb. You explain. You forgive. All automatic. All effortless on their side. But convenience has a dark effect. It breeds amnesia. People forget the emotional labor you pour into them. They forget the late nights you stayed up calming them. They forget the sacrifices you made so they wouldn't feel alone. And eventually, they forget that you had a choice in the matter. The moment your kindness turns into their expectation, the relationship slides into the territory of toxicity. Not because they actively hurt you, but because they stop seeing you. You're no longer a person, you're a function. And when someone stops seeing you, they stop respecting you. This is why good people end up in the most toxic dynamics. You're chosen not because you're weak, but because you're reliable. And reliability, in the wrong hands, becomes exploitation disguised as affection. The paradox intensifies when you finally reach your limit. When the emotional ATM you've been running starts flashing insufficient funds, people who benefited from your kindness begin to feel offended. Not because they genuinely need your help, but because they've built an internal world where your support is part of their entitlement package. Think about that. Your exhaustion feels like betrayal to them. This is the moment when resentment forms on both sides. You resent them for taking. They resent you for stopping. But the imbalance didn't start today. It started the moment your generosity became a silent promise. You start wondering, why am I never enough? But here's the truth. You were more than enough. That was the problem. You filled every gap, every need, every silence. You left no space for them to step in. You made the relationship comfortable for them and suffocating for yourself. Kindness without wisdom doesn't just attract the wrong people, it trains them. And now you're living inside the consequences of the very environment you created. A world where your effort is invisible, your care is expected, and your value gets smaller every time you try harder. The tragedy is not that they stopped appreciating you. The tragedy is that they never learned how. There's a moment in every one-sided relationship where you feel something tightening around you, but you can't name it. It's not manipulation in the obvious sense. It's not abuse in the cinematic sense. It's something quieter, more suffocating. Invisible contracts, unspoken agreements you never consciously accepted, yet somehow you keep paying the price for. These contracts form the moment someone starts expecting your kindness as a baseline. And because you've always fulfilled those expectations, you feel strangely obligated to keep doing so. You tell yourself it's loyalty, compassion, responsibility. But underneath all that moral language lies a truth you don't want to touch. You've been conditioned to overfunction. This is boundary collapse in slow motion. You don't wake up one day with no boundaries. You lose them piece by piece. Every time you say, "It's okay," when it isn't. Every time you let someone's crisis interrupt your life. Every time you bite your tongue to avoid confrontation. Every time you shrink yourself so someone else feels bigger. That's a contract being signed without ink. And once enough of these accumulate, reciprocity dies. Not dramatically, just quietly. The relationship becomes a system where you supply emotional labor and they consume it, where you apologize first, where you bend first, where you compromise first, because you believe doing so makes you the better person. But this belief is a trap built from your own goodwill. Here's the brutal truth. Relationships aren't held together by love alone. They're held together by mutual investment. If one person keeps giving and the other keeps taking, the emotional ecosystem collapses. Equilibrium is lost. Respect drains. Attachment turns into dependency on one side and resentment on the other. You start performing emotional triage without noticing it. You smooth over their insecurities, their jealousy, their mood swings, their irresponsibility. You pick up the slack. You solve the problems. You manage the fallout. You become the unofficial caretaker of their emotional world. Meanwhile, nobody manages yours. Invisible contracts work because they hide inside your guilt. When you finally say no, you feel like you're breaking some sacred rule, even though that rule was never spoken by you. It was only implied by your pattern of overextending yourself. And because people respond to patterns more than intentions, they see your withdrawal as inconsistency, not self-preservation. This is the reciprocity breakdown, when people stop contributing because they assume you will always fill the gap. And because good people hate disappointing others, you keep meeting needs that shouldn't belong to you in the first place. The dynamic becomes a psychological funnel. The more you give, the narrower your identity becomes. The relationship no longer accommodates your needs. It barely acknowledges your inner life. You stop expressing discomfort because you fear conflict. You stop asserting yourself because you fear rejection. And you stop asking for more because deep down, you no longer believe you deserve it. This isn't love. It's emotional labor disguised as devotion. And toxic people? They intuitively sense this collapse. They exploit the ambiguity. They weaponize your silence. They take your compliance as confirmation that everything they want is reasonable. Your kindness becomes their leverage. Your guilt becomes their safety net. Your self-denial becomes their comfort zone. In anthropology, there's a concept called role solidification, when a person becomes so associated with a function that they lose their individual identity. You've become the role, the fixer, the healer, the buffer, the emotional shock absorber. The tragedy is that you participated in building this dynamic without realizing it. You assumed kindness would create closeness, but kindness without boundaries creates dependence, not intimacy. Invisible contracts aren't just agreements, they're cages, and every time you try to leave, you feel the bars you never knew you built. There comes a point when you look at yourself and realize you no longer recognize the version staring back. Not because something dramatic happened, but because the erosion was gradual, like a coastline losing sand grain by grain. This is what happens when your self-worth gets placed on the clearance rack, discounted, overlooked, quietly devalued in the very relationships you tried to nurture with sincerity. It starts with small compromises. You cancel plans to be available for someone who rarely reciprocates. You tolerate behavior you would warn your friends about. You justify red flags because you've convinced yourself that good people give second chances, and third chances, and 10th chances. Eventually, your generosity stops being a moral choice. It becomes your personality, your identity, your default operating system. This is how self-worth erodes, not because someone directly attacks it, but because you repeatedly deprioritize yourself in the name of kindness. Humans are creatures of pattern recognition. When you consistently signal that your needs are flexible, people subconsciously agree. When you act as if your time is negotiable, your value becomes negotiable. When you behave like your emotional boundaries are optional, people treat them like background suggestions rather than requirements. You don't realize it, but you are teaching others how to treat you. And here's the darkest twist. You begin teaching yourself the same lesson. You become the person who apologizes for asking for help. The person who feels guilty for being tired. The person who believes their worth is directly tied to usefulness. Your kindness becomes a survival strategy, an emotional discount you offer so people won't leave. This mindset is devastating because it reinforces a dangerous psychological loop. If you're always the one giving, then you never get to experience being valued simply for existing, only for performing. This is how learned helplessness sneaks in. You stop trying to express your needs because past attempts went unnoticed or unreciprocated. You stop believing anyone will show up for you, so you don't bother asking. You stop expecting care, so you treat your own exhaustion like an inconvenience rather than a warning sign. The result is a relationship ecosystem where you're simultaneously the foundation and the least considered element. Meanwhile, the other person continues living comfortably within the structure you built. They don't feel the imbalance because you've shielded them from ever needing to confront it. You cushion their discomfort with your effort. You absorb their irresponsibility with your patience. You disguise their emotional immaturity with your competence. Your self-worth shrinks not because you lack value, but because you've stopped giving yourself permission to express it. And once your identity becomes built on being the strong one, you become trapped by the role. You fear that if you stop performing kindness, people will finally see how tired you are. And if they see how tired you are, maybe they'll decide you're no longer worth keeping. That's the invisible nightmare. The belief that your presence alone isn't enough, that you must earn every ounce of affection through service, sacrifice, accommodation. But a relationship built on your self-erasure is not a relationship. It's a dependency disguised as devotion. You think you're holding everything together, but really, you're holding yourself hostage. This is the tragedy good people face. Your kindness becomes the armor that keeps you soft, but it also becomes the chain that keeps you stuck. And the longer you stay in that role, the more distant your true self becomes. You forget your preferences, your desires, your boundaries. You become fluent in everyone else's needs and illiterate in your own. And that's how self-worth slips to the bottom shelf. Unnoticed, unprotected, quietly abandoned. Not because others demanded it, but because you slowly convinced yourself that you didn't need it. There's a moment, quiet, heavy, almost embarrassing, when you finally admit to yourself that you've stayed too long. Not because you're naive, not because you enjoy suffering, but because you've already invested so much that leaving feels like losing a part of your identity. This is the trap of sunk-cost kindness. When you keep giving, not because the relationship is healthy, but because you can't bear the idea that all your emotional labor might have been for nothing. Loss aversion works differently in relationships than in finance. In money, you fear losing dollars. In relationships, you fear losing meaning. Every late-night conversation you endured, every compromise you swallowed, every moment you put their needs before yours, these become emotional receipts you don't want to throw away. So you keep investing, hoping the returns will eventually show up. But toxic dynamics don't appreciate over time. They depreciate. They drain. They consume. You begin to rationalize the imbalance. Maybe they're just stressed. Maybe they'll change. Maybe this is just a phase. But if you're honest with yourself, those maybes are self-deception loops. Internal stories you tell to soften the sharp edge of reality. because accepting the truth would force you to confront the weight of everything you've sacrificed. Self-deception isn't a flaw, it's a coping mechanism. Your mind tries to protect you from the pain of acknowledging that all your kindness was misallocated, that you kept depositing into an emotional account that paid you back in scarcity, that you offered loyalty to someone who only offered convenience in return. And when you finally consider pulling away, something strange happens. You feel guilty, as if stepping back is an act of betrayal. This guilt isn't moral, it's conditioned. Learned helplessness has woven itself into your emotional reflexes. You've been the caretaker for so long that reclaiming your autonomy feels like abandonment. Meanwhile, the other person rarely fights to keep you. They fight to keep the benefits you provided. They don't miss you. They miss the services, the validation, the consolation, the stability, the emotional scaffolding you built around their dysfunction. They miss what you did for them, not who you were. This difference is the wound good people struggle to face. Here's the hidden truth. Toxicity doesn't survive because it is strong. It survives because you keep feeding it. You keep explaining, forgiving, adjusting, and supporting. Your effort creates the illusion of a relationship where none truly exists. Your kindness becomes the oxygen supply for something that cannot breathe on its own. And yet, even when the relationship hurts you, even when it drains every part of your emotional ecosystem, you hesitate to let go. Because leaving means accepting that the past cannot be repaired. It means acknowledging that love, at least your version of it, wasn't enough to change the outcome. But here's the part nobody tells you. You don't stay because the relationship is meaningful. You stay because you hope the meaning will eventually appear. That hope is the final chain. When you step back, even slightly, you begin to see how much weight you were carrying alone. You notice how the silence feels unfamiliar because you were the one filling it. You see how many fires went out the moment you stopped being the firefighter. You realize how little of the relationship existed outside your effort. There is freedom in that realization, but also grief. The grief of recognizing that some relationships only survive because you refuse to let them die. The grief of seeing that your kindness was never the problem, but your strategy was. Kindness is powerful, but kindness without boundaries becomes a liability. Kindness without wisdom becomes fuel for the wrong people. Kindness without self-respect becomes the reason you lose yourself while trying to save someone else. And once you see that truth, the question changes. It's no longer, how do I get them to value me? But why did I stay where my value was never recognized? You walk away not because you stopped caring, but because you finally understood that your heart is not an infinite resource. You walk away because you've stopped mistaking endurance for love. You walk away because you deserve relationships that don't require self-sacrifice to survive. In the quiet after everything, after the exhaustion, after the self-denial, after the desperate attempts to hold something together, you finally feel the stillness of truth settling in. It's softer than you expect. Not a rupture, not a collapse, just a gentle awareness that your worth was never supposed to be negotiated, discounted, or proven through sacrifice. You start to see that boundaries aren't walls. They're the simple act of choosing yourself without apology. And the moment you choose yourself, the entire emotional economy of your life shifts. What once felt like obligation begins to look like clarity. What once felt like loss begins to feel like liberation. You realize that kindness is still one of your greatest strengths, but only when it's guided by wisdom, self-respect, and intentionality. You learn to give without erasing yourself. You learn to love without abandoning your needs. And you learn that walking away isn't failure. It's the first act of reclaiming your life. So tonight, let this awareness settle. Let it be quiet. Let it be yours.